short rests or long rests? Which is better for maximizing muscle growth? Traditionally, short rest intervals were believed to be optimal for building muscle. Indeed, a 1987 study by Kramer and colleagues found that bodybuilders used around 10 to 90 seconds of rest between sets. This was in contrast to powerlifters, who rested around 120 to 140 seconds between sets. Even today, if you follow any social media general fitness pages or have read any classic personal training textbooks, you may have come across the notion that shorter rest periods are superior for building muscle, whereas longer rest periods are better for building strength. The idea shorter rest intervals are superior for muscle growth does have origins in scientific research. Research has shown that when using shorter rest intervals, anabolic hormones, mainly growth hormone, are elevated significantly more than using longer rest intervals. It's speculated this greater acute elevation in anabolic hormones would result in greater muscle growth. However, we cannot necessarily assume just because something induces a greater acute hormonal response, it will cause greater muscle growth. Interestingly, when looking at the current research, greater acute anabolic hormone elevations do not appear to be correlated to muscle growth. As a result, the idea that shorter rest intervals produce greater muscle growth due to the greater acute hormonal response is not supported. Opposed to the research assessing the acute hormonal responses to various rest intervals, it would be much better to look at research assessing measures of muscle growth before and after a set duration in groups using different rest intervals. Let us evaluate this research. For compound exercises, the weight of the current evidence suggests that longer rest intervals may be superior to shorter rest intervals for building muscle. Compound exercises involve the movement of two or more joints, resulting in multiple muscle groups being trained. Examples include the back squat, bench press, deadlift, barbell row, overhead press, and many more. Let's briefly overview the research on compound exercises and rest intervals. Longo and colleagues had 28 untrained individuals perform leg presses for 3 sets to failure, which is the point at which no more repetitions can be performed, with an 80% 1 rep max load twice per week for 10 weeks. Increases in quadriceps cross-sectional area were superior when resting for 3 minutes between sets compared to resting 1 minute between sets. Schoenfeld and colleagues had 13 men with at least 6 months of training experience perform a range of exercises, each for 3 sets to failure with an 8 to 12 rep max load 3 times per week for 8 weeks. The exercises were the back squat, leg press, leg extension, bench press, overhead press, lat pull down, and cable row. Except for the leg extension, all of these exercises are compound. Increases in elbow flexor, triceps brachii, anterior quadriceps, and vastus lateralis thickness favored the group resting for 3 minutes compared to the group resting for 1 minute between sets. Baresh and colleagues split 12 men with some training experience, but not in the 3 months before the study, into a group resting 2.5 minutes between sets or a group resting 1 minute between sets. Both groups trained 4 times per week for 10 weeks, with workout 1 and workout 2 each repeated twice per week. A range of compound exercises were used. The group resting 2.5 minutes between sets experienced greater increases in thigh and arm cross-sectional area. Fink and colleagues split 14 untrained individuals into a group resting 2.5 minutes between sets or a group resting 30 seconds between sets. Both groups trained the bench press and back squat for 4 sets to failure with a 40% 1 rep max load twice per week for 8 weeks. You may be questioning the 40% 1 rep max load. However, for hypertrophy, this is perfectly fine. The current evidence suggests that loads between 30% and 85% 1 rep max produce similar hypertrophy, provided reps are performed to failure. Increases in triceps cross-sectional area were similar between both groups, but increases in thigh cross-sectional area favored the group resting 2.5 minutes between sets. There actually is one paper finding shorter rest intervals to be superior for muscle growth with compound exercises. Villanova and colleagues split 22 untrained elderly men, their average age was 68 years old, into a group resting 4 minutes between sets or a group resting 1 minute between sets. Both groups performed the leg press, machine chest press, lat pull down, seated row, dumbbell step-ups, dumbbell Romanian deadlifts, knee extensions, and leg curls for 2 to 3 sets with 4 to 6 reps, 3 times per week for 8 weeks. Increases in lean body mass were superior for the group resting 1 minute between sets. However, this study does have limitations. The subjects were elderly men. Later, we'll explore how age impacts recovery between sets. But more importantly, volume load, the product of sets times reps times load, was equated between the 1 minute rest group and the 4 minute rest group. This would have meant that the 1 minute rest group was training closer to failure. To illustrate this, let's say your 1 rep max on the bench press is 100 kilograms and you had to perform 3 sets of 8 reps with 75 kilograms. Which would be more difficult, resting 1 minute between sets or resting 4 minutes between sets? Of course, resting 1 minute between sets would be harder, as you would be training closer to failure on your subsequent sets, thanks to the decreased recovery time. Therefore, it's unclear what the results of the Villanova and colleagues study would look like if both the 1 minute rest group and 4 minute rest group took their sets to failure. Remember, the 4 studies we have looked at so far, finding greater hypertrophy for longer rest intervals, had subjects take their sets to, or close to, failure. So, the current evidence suggests that when subjects train with the same program and proximity to failure, longer rest intervals, so 2.5 to 3 minutes, seem to produce greater hypertrophy than shorter rest intervals, 1 minute or less, with compound exercises. The same training program detail is worth elaborating on. The same training program would imply that a longer rest group and a shorter rest group perform the same number of sets on their exercises. There is some evidence suggesting that if you use shorter rest intervals, performing more sets may be compensatory, meaning that more sets and shorter rest intervals could produce similar hypertrophy to fewer sets and longer rest intervals. Returning to the Longo and colleagues study, they found that when subjects trained twice per week for 10 weeks, performing 4 to 5 sets to failure on the leg press with an 80% 1 rep max load and 1 minute of rest between sets, produced similar increases in quadriceps cross-sectional area to performing 3 sets to failure on the leg press with an 80% 1 rep max load and 3 minutes of rest between sets. Atayanin and colleagues found that resting 2 minutes between sets produced similar increases in quadriceps cross-sectional area to resting 5 minutes between sets when participants performed an average 1 more set when resting 2 minutes between sets. Although 2 minutes of rest between sets would not be seen as a short rest interval to many people, another way one could potentially interpret this study is that despite the more sets, 2 minutes of rest between sets could be sufficient, and resting for longer may not be required. Unfortunately, there currently isn't any other papers comparing 2 minutes of rest between sets to other longer rest intervals for hypertrophy. As a result, we can only conclude that based on the current evidence, with all else equal, longer rest intervals, so 2.5 to 3 minutes, produce greater hypertrophy than shorter rest intervals of 1 minute or less, with compound exercises. However, when all else is not equal, this might not be the case. Specifically, performing 1 or 2 more sets with shorter rest intervals may be able to produce similar hypertrophy to longer rest intervals. Unfortunately, with isolation exercises, the evidence is less clear on how long you should rest. Isolation exercises primarily involve movement at one joint, resulting in primarily one muscle group being trained. Examples include bicep curls, triceps pushdowns, lateral raises, leg extensions, leg curls, and many more. Returning to the Baresh and colleagues study, a range of isolation exercises were used. As already mentioned, increases in arm and thigh cross-sectional area were greater for the group resting 2.5 minutes between sets compared to the group resting 1 minute between sets. Therefore, this study implies longer rest intervals are also favourable with isolation movements. However, it could be argued that the use of compound exercises in the study somewhat confounded our ability to truly deduce if longer rest intervals are better with isolation movements. What about the research evaluating rest intervals with isolation exercises exclusively? Fink and colleagues had 22 individuals perform bicep curls, preacher curls, hammer curls, close grip bench presses, tricep skull crushers, and dumbbell extensions. Except for the close grip bench press, all of these exercises are isolation, but the close grip bench press was used to isolate the triceps, so this is not really a problem. The researchers had one group perform these exercises with a 20 rep max load and 30 seconds of rest between sets, and another group performed them with an 8 rep max load and 3 minutes of rest between sets. Both groups took their sets to failure and performed the same number of sets. For some reason, the paper did not state the number of sets performed. Both groups trained twice per week for 8 weeks. Increases in arm cross-sectional area favoured the group using a 20 rep max load and 30 seconds of rest between sets. Therefore, this study suggests that with isolation exercises, shorter rest intervals may be superior. Load was not controlled. The group that rested 30 seconds between sets used a 20 rep max load, while the group that rested 3 minutes between sets used an 8 rep max load. It could be argued that this somewhat confounded the study. Recall earlier, I mentioned that the current evidence suggests that loads between 30% and 85% of 1 rep max produce similar growth when reps are performed to failure. This would imply that the use of different loads should not matter. Another study by Okazi and colleagues assigned each arm of 9 untrained men into one of 3 conditions: 3 sets to failure with an 80% 1 rep max load and 3 minutes of rest between sets, 3 sets to failure with a 30% 1 rep max load and 90 seconds of rest between sets, or a drop set condition. The drop set condition had the arm perform an initial set to failure with an 80% 1 rep max load. Immediately after, they performed 4 drop sets to failure, starting with a 65% 1 rep max load, then a 50% 1 rep max load, then a 40% 1 rep max load, and finally a 30% 1 rep max load. All 3 conditions involve training the unilateral dumbbell biceps curl 2 to 3 times per week for 8 weeks. Increases in cross-sectional area of the elbow flexors, which included the biceps brachii and brachialis, were similar between all 3 conditions. Therefore, this study implies that with isolation exercises, rest intervals may not matter at all. Not only did 3 minutes of rest produce similar growth to 90 seconds of rest, but virtually no rest between sets, the drop set condition, was not any worse. Now, the drop set condition did technically perform 5 sets, which is 2 more than the other 2 conditions. More sets generally result in more growth, and so this could have helped out the drop set condition. So, the current evidence is completely conflicting with regards to rest intervals and isolation exercises, with one paper finding longer rest intervals to be superior, another finding shorter rest intervals to be superior, and even one finding no differences between various rest intervals. To muddy the waters even further, there is one paper finding drop set training, so no rest between sets, to be superior to traditional training for hypertrophy with an isolation exercise. Fink and colleagues split 16 men, untrained in the last year, into a normal set group or a drop set group. Both groups trained the triceps pushdown twice per week for 8 weeks. The drop set group performed a single set to failure with a 12 rep max load, immediately decreasing the load by 20% each time failure was reached 3 times in a row. The normal set group performed 3 sets to failure with a 12 rep max load and 90 seconds of rest between sets. Increases in triceps cross-sectional area favoured the drop set group. In this study, the drop set group did technically perform 1 more set than the normal set group. Similar to the Okazi and colleagues study, this could have helped out the drop set condition. Given the conflicting evidence, we don't really have any grounds to conclude if shorter rest intervals or longer rest intervals are better for hypertrophy with isolation exercises. I think it's sensible to suggest that one should aim to rest however long they feel is comfortable and practical with these movements. Although we were unable to conclude if longer or shorter rest intervals are preferred with isolation exercises, we did conclude that with compound exercises, longer rest intervals appear to be favourable. Why might longer rest intervals produce greater hypertrophy with compound exercises? Some researchers have suggested this is because longer rest intervals allow for a higher volume load, the product of sets times reps times load. For instance, in the already mentioned Longo and colleagues study, they measured the volume load completed over the 10-week duration in the two conditions performing 3 sets on the leg press twice per week for 10 weeks. Total volume load was higher in the condition that rested 3 minutes between sets versus the condition that rested 1 minute between sets. The authors contended that this higher volume load, accumulated with the 3-minute rest condition, explained the greater increases in quadriceps cross-sectional area observed for this condition. However, this assumes that higher volume loads result in more growth. When overviewing the research, this isn't the case. To be clear, volume, in the form of weekly sets, is related to hypertrophy. For instance, a meta-analysis by Schoenfeld and colleagues found that with all else equal, the more sets that are to or close to failure performed per week, the greater the muscle growth. But the number of weekly sets that are to or close to failure and volume load is not the same thing. Remember, in the Longo and colleagues study, both the 3-minute rest condition and 1-minute rest condition involve 3 sets to failure on the leg press each session. But as just mentioned, volume load was higher for the 3-minute rest condition. Here's the important point. We have strong evidence volume load is unrelated to muscle growth. This comes from research on rep ranges. As already mentioned, loads between 30% and 85% 1 rep max appear to produce similar muscle growth, provided reps are taken to failure. Based on this, 3 sets to failure with an 80% 1 rep max load should produce similar muscle growth to performing 3 sets to failure with a 60% 1 rep max load. Let's say an individual's 1 rep max is 100 kilograms on an exercise. When performing 3 sets to failure with an 80% 1 rep max load, so 80 kilograms, assuming a longer rest interval, we might expect them to get 7 reps on the first set, 6 reps on the second set, and 5 reps on the final set. This would give us a volume load of 4,320 kilograms. When performing 3 sets to failure with a 60% 1 rep max load, so 60 kilograms, providing a longer rest interval, we might expect them to get 15 reps on the first set, 13 reps on the second set, and 11 reps on the final set. This would give us a volume load of 7,020 kilograms. If volume load was an indicator of muscle growth, we would expect 3 sets with a 60% 1 rep max load to produce greater hypertrophy than 3 sets with an 80% 1 rep max load. But from the research on rep ranges, both protocols would probably produce similar hypertrophy. Therefore, the idea that longer rest intervals produce greater hypertrophy because they enable higher volume loads cannot be true. Moreover, if volume load was the reason, why would this not apply to isolation exercises? Longer rest intervals would allow a greater volume load with isolation exercises. Yet, as established, the research on rest intervals and isolation exercises is conflicting. A stronger hypothesis behind why longer rest intervals appear to produce greater hypertrophy with compound exercises relates to central fatigue. I must credit Chris Beardsley, Eric Helms, and James Krieger from where I initially came across this hypothesis. It was their work that inspired me to research this area much further. To understand this hypothesis, we need to understand central fatigue. The reason muscles produce force is because they receive signals originating from the central nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord. There are 2 neurons involved here, an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. Upper motor neurons originate in the cerebral cortex, which is the outer layer of the cerebrum. The cerebrum refers to the 2 hemispheres of the brain. Upper motor neurons mostly end at a region in the spinal cord. Lower motor neurons mostly start at a region in the spinal cord and end at a particular muscle. Upper motor neurons transmit electrical signals to lower motor neurons, which relay this signal to a muscle, causing muscle contraction. Central fatigue refers to a decrease in these electrical signals to the muscle. At the level of the muscle, this means that not only do the recruited muscle fibers produce less force, but fewer muscle fibers are recruited overall. This is the opposite of what we want for maximizing muscle growth. We want high levels of muscle fiber recruitment and high levels of force produced by each of those recruited muscle fibers. During a set on an exercise to or close to failure, central fatigue likely develops. There are numerous potential mechanisms behind how central fatigue occurs during exercise. One particular mechanism that is linked to hypertrophy training sets is afferent feedback. Afferents are neurons that transmit information from organs to the central nervous system. There are sensory neurons linking muscles to the central nervous system. Two of these, group 3 afferents and group 4 afferents, have been associated with central fatigue. Group 3 afferents are primarily sensitive to strong levels of muscle contraction, but they do also appear to respond to the buildup of metabolites. Group 4 afferents are primarily sensitive to the buildup of metabolites within the muscle, but they do also appear to respond to strong levels of muscle contraction. Just to be clear, the buildup of metabolites refers to the increase of various products linked to chemical reactions in the muscle, such as lactate, inorganic phosphate, and hydrogen ions. When training to or close to failure, the majority of a muscle's fibers would be producing strong contractions. Additionally, the buildup of metabolites likely occurs too, especially during higher repetition sets. In response to these conditions, Group 3 and Group 4 afferents can directly or indirectly reduce the electrical signal sent down by lower motor neurons. This means less force production from recruited muscle fibers, as well as a reduction in the overall muscle fibers recruited, which, as established, is what we do not want. It's impossible to remove central fatigue during our sets. However, we would want to begin our next set once this central fatigue has disappeared, and this is the basis of the hypothesis. It's believed longer rest intervals would make it less likely for us to begin a set when central fatigue is still present. However, why would this particular argument only apply to compound and not isolation exercises? Some evidence indirectly implies that the more muscle mass involved in an exercise, the greater the central fatigue generated. Because compound exercises involve a greater amount of muscle mass compared to isolation exercises, this would imply that sets of compound exercises produce greater central fatigue and thus require longer rest intervals compared to isolation exercises. But I have come across research opposing this central fatigue hypothesis. A review paper by Weevil and colleagues actually suggests that the less muscle mass in an exercise, the greater the central fatigue generated. An isometric unilateral elbow flexion contraction produced greater central fatigue than unilateral knee extensions. These knee extensions also produced greater central fatigue than cycling. Out of these three modes of exercise, cycling involves the greatest amount of muscle mass, followed by unilateral knee extensions, and then unilateral elbow flexion contractions. Furthermore, as far as I'm aware, there are no studies investigating how quickly central fatigue disappears after sets of typical weight training exercises, but there is indirect data that would imply central fatigue disappears fairly rapidly. Kennedy and colleagues had subjects perform a maximum voluntary contraction of the quadriceps for 2 minutes. Immediately after, there were minimal signs of central fatigue. Another study by Kennedy and colleagues had subjects perform a 2-minute maximum voluntary contraction of the adductor pollicis, which is a muscle of the hand. Central fatigue had almost fully dissipated after 1 minute of rest. Todd and colleagues had subjects perform a 2-minute maximum voluntary contraction for the elbow flexors. Central fatigue had dissipated within 30 seconds of completing the exercise. Of course, these protocols are not identical to sets with typical weight training exercises. Most exercises are performed with a concentric and eccentric phase, while the mentioned studies involved maximum isometric contractions. Moreover, All of these studies involve 2-minute contractions. Most typical sets last far less than 2 minutes. This is an important point. There seems to be a belief that heavier loads, and therefore shorter set durations, cause the most central fatigue. However, this is a misconception. Lighter loads, and therefore longer duration sets, seem to cause greater central fatigue. This study had subjects perform an isometric contraction with their quadriceps for 33 straight minutes at 15% of their maximum voluntary isometric contraction strength. The authors noted central fatigue dissipated within 3 to 9 minutes after this protocol. Another study had subjects perform an isometric contraction with their elbow flexors for 43 straight minutes at 15% of their maximum voluntary isometric contraction. Central fatigue took roughly 20 minutes to disappear. Smith and colleagues had subjects perform an isometric contraction with their elbow flexors for 70 straight minutes at 5% of their maximum voluntary isometric contraction. 30 minutes after finishing this, central fatigue was still present. They did not take any further measurements after these 30 minutes, so we do not know when central fatigue fully dissipated. Therefore, given typical hypertrophy sets are generally shorter in duration than 2 minutes, the indirect evidence would suggest that central fatigue should disappear quicker than the values we saw for the various 2-minute isometric contractions, potentially implying that central fatigue disappears after 30 seconds or less of typical hypertrophy sets. But as we saw with the research, 2.5 to 3 minute rest intervals produced greater hypertrophy than 1 minute or less with compound exercises. As a result, there seems to be a potential flaw with the central fatigue hypothesis. I should note the research we have looked at assessing how long it takes for central fatigue to disappear used isometric contractions for only one muscle group, essentially meaning they are isolation exercises. But remember, although there is some indirect evidence suggesting compound exercises could induce greater central fatigue than isolation exercises, the review paper by Weevil and colleagues suggests otherwise. At the end of the day, to truly know if central fatigue could be the reason behind why longer rest intervals are superior with compound exercises, we would need research assessing how long central fatigue takes to disappear after various sets with compound exercises, as well as isolation exercises. Aside from distinguishing between compound and isolation exercises, it's often overlooked that sex, age, and even your current strength levels can play a role in determining the duration of rest intervals. Most of the studies looked at so far had men as their subjects, though a few studies did have both men and women as their subjects. But this clouds our ability to draw out any potential differences between men and women. Some evidence suggests women may be able to recover quicker between sets compared to men. Ratames and colleagues recruited 22 men and women with at least 1 year of training experience. The subjects performed 3 sets on the bench press with a 75% 1 rep max load. On 3 separate occasions, they performed this protocol with either 1 minute, 2 minute, or 3 minutes of rest between sets. The subjects were encouraged to perform 10 reps per set. Looking at the results, regardless of the rest interval used, women performed a higher number of reps over the 3 sets compared to the men, indicating they had a greater recovery ability. Other studies also have similar findings. However, the authors noted that when they adjusted for bench press strength, there was no difference in repetition performance between men and women over the 3 sets. This would suggest that gender per se did not explain the faster recovery. Rather, it appears your strength level impacts how quickly you recover. In other words, the weaker you are on an exercise, the quicker your performance can recover. Conversely, the stronger you are on an exercise, the longer it would take for your performance to recover. In this study, the woman's average bench press 1 rep max was 36 kilograms, while the men's average bench press 1 rep max was 112 kilograms. Given the women were weaker than the men in this study, this seemed to explain why they were better able to sustain their repetitions from set to set. To further test this idea, the researchers had a second part of the study. 22 men were split into a low 1 rep max group or a high 1 rep max group. On average, the low 1 rep max group's bench press was 81 kilograms, while the high 1 rep max group's bench press was 141 kilograms. The subjects performed 3 sets on the bench press with a 75% 1 rep max load. On 3 separate occasions, they performed this with either 1 minute, 2 minutes, or 3 minutes of rest between sets. The subjects were encouraged to perform 10 reps per set. Looking at the results, regardless of the rest interval used, the low 1 rep max group were able to sustain their repetitions across the 3 sets better than the high 1 rep max group. Therefore, regardless if you're a man or woman, the weaker you are on an exercise, the faster you can probably recover between sets of that exercise, and so your rest intervals need not be excessive here. Having said all of this, there is other evidence suggesting that when women and men are matched for strength, women are still able to recover faster. Fulco and colleagues matched 9 men and 9 women for strength of their adductor pollicis. The researchers had subjects perform a fatiguing isometric contraction of the adductor pollicis. 1 minute after this, the woman had recovered to 71% of their baseline strength, while the men only recovered to 65% of their baseline strength. Research comparing various physiological and anatomical differences between men and women also support the idea women may intrinsically have the ability to recover quicker between sets. Some evidence indicates women have greater blood flow than men. Greater blood flow to the muscle would accelerate the recovery process between sets. Additionally, some evidence suggests that women have a higher proportional area of type 1 muscle fibers compared to men. Type 1 fibers, often called slow twitch muscle fibers, have faster recovery abilities and are more fatigue resistant compared to type 2 fibers, which are often called fast twitch muscle fibers. Based on this, women would not only be able to recover quicker between sets, but each set would also generate less fatigue. So, irrespective of whether their exercise is isolation or compound, women can probably rest shorter than men would, without any problem. Although we could not conclude anything with isolation exercises, we did conclude that with compound exercises, 2.5 to 3 minutes of rest between sets was superior to shorter durations. But this conclusion was from studies that mainly involved men. Women may be able to get away with resting 1 to 2 minutes between sets of compound exercises. All but one of the studies assessed so far have focused on young men and women. 2 studies suggest that elderly men and women may be able to recover faster between sets than younger men and women. Theo and colleagues recruited 20 young women between 20 and 30 years old, and 16 elderly women between 60 and 80 years old. The researchers had these subjects perform 3 sets with an 8 rep max load on an isokinetic dynamometer designed to provide knee extension and knee flexion resistance. On 3 different days, they performed this with either 15 seconds, 30 seconds, or 60 seconds of rest between sets. For both the young and elderly women, 60 seconds of rest resulted in the maintenance of knee extension torque throughout the 3 sets, while the 30 and 15-second rest intervals did not. Neither the young or old woman were able to maintain knee flexor torque across the 3 sets with 15 seconds of rest between sets, but both were able to maintain knee flexor torque with 60 seconds of rest between sets. But the elderly woman were also able to maintain knee flexor torque throughout the 3 sets with 30 seconds of rest between sets. This implies that for the elderly, 30 seconds of rest between sets was sufficient to recover knee flexion torque, whereas the younger woman required 60 seconds of rest between sets. Therefore, this study partially supports the idea that elderly women may be able to recover quicker between sets compared to younger women. Another study by Botaro and colleagues recruited 17 young men. Their average age was 25 years old, and 20 elderly men. Their average age was 66 years old. The subjects performed knee extensions for 3 sets of 10 reps. On 2 separate occasions, they performed this with either 60 seconds or 120 seconds of rest between sets. With both rest intervals, the young men experienced a greater decline in peak knee extension torque across the 3 sets compared to the elderly men, indicating the elderly men had a quicker recovery between their sets. In the 2 studies, the elderly subjects were weaker compared to the younger subjects. As discussed already, this strength difference likely would partly explain why the elderly may be able to recover quicker between sets. However, there is also evidence that with aging, there is a decrease in the size of type 2 muscle fibers and an increase in the proportion of type 1 muscle fibers. As mentioned, type 1 fibers have quicker recovery abilities and are more fatigue resistant compared to type 2 fibers. This would be another potential reason behind why the elderly may be able to recover quicker between sets compared to the young. When we looked at the research on compound exercises and muscle growth, the study by Villanova and colleagues was conducted on elderly men. The average age was 68 years old. Increases in lean body mass were greater for the group resting 1 minute between sets compared to the group resting 4 minutes between sets. On the face of it, this would support the idea that the elderly can successfully use shorter rest intervals. But recall, volume load was equated between the two groups, meaning the 1 minute rest group would have been training closer to failure than the 4 minute rest group. Therefore, it's unclear how this study would conclude if both groups took their sets to failure. So more research would be required to truly get an idea of what rest intervals promote greater hypertrophy in the elderly. Ultimately, from the acute research, the elderly can probably rest less between their sets compared to the young. With isolation exercises, the only sensible advice to give based on the current evidence would be to select a rest interval the elderly may find comfortable and practical. For compound exercises, given the majority of the evidence implies that 2.5 to 3 minutes of rest between sets produces greater hypertrophy than shorter rest durations in young men, it could be assumed that the elderly may be able to achieve optimal muscle growth with a rest interval shorter than this. Perhaps 1 to 2 minutes of rest between sets of compound exercises is sufficient. There is some evidence that a person could over time slowly decrease the duration of their rest intervals without compromising muscle hypertrophy. De Souza and colleagues split 20 men with at least 1 year of training experience into a constant rest group or a decreasing rest group. Both groups trained 6 days per week for 8 weeks. For the first 2 weeks, both groups trained identically. They performed all exercises for 3 sets with a 10 to 12 rep max load and 2 minutes of rest between sets. Workout 1 and Workout 2 were each performed 3 times per week. From weeks 3 to 8, both groups performed each exercise for 4 sets with an 8 to 10 rep max load, but their rest intervals differed. Their weekly workout schedule also changed. The constant rest group continued using 2 minutes of rest between sets. The decreasing rest group, throughout these 6 weeks, gradually decreased the duration of their rest intervals weekly from 105 seconds to 30 seconds of rest between sets. After the 8 weeks, increases in thigh and arm cross-sectional area were similar between both groups. Put differently, gradually decreasing your rest duration week to week appeared to not compromise muscle growth in comparison to a group consistently resting 2 minutes between sets. A range of compound and isolation exercises were performed by both groups. Returning to our findings much earlier, the research is conflicting on whether long or short rest intervals are optimal with isolation exercises. But with compound exercises, 2.5 to 3 minutes of rest between sets produced greater increases in muscle hypertrophy versus shorter rest durations. Based on this information, you could argue that the constant rest group was not resting optimally anyway, as they rested only 2 minutes between sets. Given 2.5 to 3 minutes of rest is preferred for compound exercises, we cannot truly conclude that gradually decreasing rest intervals does not compromise muscle growth. At the same time though, it's important to consider that the conclusion 2.5 to 3 minutes of rest is preferred for compound exercises comes from research comparing this rest interval to durations of 1 minute or less. It's possible that when comparing 2.5 to 3 minutes of rest to 2 minutes of rest between sets with compound exercises, there would be no difference in muscle growth. But there is no research assessing this. Hopefully future research looks at this. So, although the preliminary evidence on the use of decreasing rest intervals is somewhat promising, more evidence is still most definitely required. Also, once an individual has reached a short rest interval and decides to maintain this rest interval, it's not clear how this would compare to someone using a longer rest interval in the long term. For example, in the De Souza and colleagues study, the decreasing rest group used 30 seconds of rest between sets in their final week. What if they maintained this rest interval for, say, the next 10 weeks? Would increases in arm and thigh cross-sectional area still be similar to the constant rest group using a 2-minute rest interval? Again, future research would be needed to address this question.